Let's check the computer.
That's right.
Yeah, I sure think that.
Maybe some of it'll rub off.
The reason you sit here is because you don't sit over there and look through that.
Jack's
That's why I had to
monitoring
move,
things
because yesterday.
Oh, that's true. That's right.
This is right.
Yeah, I was on this side last week, so. We were on the other side, and that little thing was blocked.
Oh, it blocked. Oh, I didn't. Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay.
So I kept going like this.
Morning, sir.
Morning, everyone. Good to see all of you. The faithful remnant here.
How many guys were on TV last week?
30-ish.
See?
That's a good crowd.
30, and there was
30 plus.
20 here, so.
Yep, or the live stream.
We had a 20 year.
Yep, okay, you can go.
Okay, people, well, welcome back. This is session 2 on our presentation on the Christian hope, the Apostle Paul's gospel for today, which is a study in 4 parts of Paul's epistle known as 1 Corinthians. My name is Buzz Myers. I am a religious studies professor at Gettysburg College, but I'm also an ordained Presbyterian minister and regular at Derry Presbyterian Church. I've been here, I think, in the fall for the last 20 years. So it's great to be back, and it's great to deal with this good material. We're going to be dealing with material now in the rest of chapters 1 through 7. We did some of chapters 1 through 3 last time. So we're going to try and get through 7, and 7's got a lot of good background material that I will give you to help you understand what Paul's dealing with in those chapters as well. But I like to title this one, "And You Think Your Church Has Problems." Corinth is an unbelievable place. There are just all kinds of things happening there that Paul is going to address. So I'm going to go back and review. Some of you are new this week. I don't know if people were able to look online if you were not here last week, but let me just review quickly some of the things that we dealt with last week. One of the things that I made clear last week is that there are 7 of the 13 Pauline epistles in the New Testament that are unquestionably by Paul. They are called the Undisputed Pauline epistles. They are 7 in number, and in canonical order, they go Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Now, we're dealing with 1 Corinthians here, and as I indicated last week, the order of these writings is not based on when they were composed or in any kind of geographical basis or whatever. Those are ordered simply in terms of length. So Romans is Paul's longest letter to a church. Philemon is his shortest letter to an individual. The very fact that 1 Corinthians follows Romans is an indication that we're dealing with one of the major writings of Paul. And the very fact that you have 1 and 2 Corinthians, both of which are relatively long letters, this is the most material Paul wrote to any community of faith. And that's one of the fun things, I think, in dealing with 1 and 2 Corinthians is seeing Paul interact with the community over a period of several years and through several writings as well. So you get a real feel for how Paul interacted with this particular community of faith. Why is it important to segregate the 7 undisputed Pauline writings? Because these are the earliest writings of the New Testament. All of them were composed in the 50s. It's believed that Jesus died in about the year 30. So these come 20 to 25 years after the death of Jesus. The earliest writing of the New Testament is 1 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians. And 1 Thessalonians, as we look at the chronological order of these epistles, 1 Thessalonians is believed to be first, followed by Galatians. And then comes 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, and Philemon. Again, we get in 1 Corinthians, we see that this is not the first letter that Paul has written. Paul's already done 1 Thessalonians and Galatians, but he has yet to do 2 Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, and Philemon. Well, based on this, the literature that we have in the New Testament, we have to figure out Paul's relationship with this community of faith. We have to understand something about them to understand what Paul's writing to this community and what they probably already know, what they have heard from Paul, and the like. So based on simply what Paul says, this isn't dealing with Acts or anything else, it's only dealing with what Paul says, we know that Paul visited this church probably in the late 40s. And he visited and founded the church at that time. So he uses language in chapter 3 and 4 about his founding of this church. He said, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. Clearly, he is the founder of this community. He goes on to say a few verses later, according to the grace of God given to me like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation, someone else is building on it. And then in the next chapter, he's going to say, for though you have 10,000 guardians in Christ, you do not have many fathers. Indeed, in Christ Jesus, I became your father through the gospel. So Paul founds the community in the late 40s. He then is going to spend, according to Acts here, about 18 months in that community, and then he's going to leave. After he leaves, he keeps in touch with this community by means of a letter. So he's going to write a letter, and that letter is referred to in a passage here in chapter 5. He says, I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral persons, not at all meaning the immoral of this world or the greedy and robbers or idolaters, since you would then need go out of the world. Well, notice the past tense, I wrote to you. He's writing 1 Corinthians at the time, and he said, I wrote to you in my letter. Well, that letter is in fact Paul's first letter to the community at Corinth, and that's a letter that we do not have. So we don't know of all of the writings that Paul composed. We don't know how many letters Paul actually wrote, but here is one that comes prior to 1 Corinthians. He's going to go on in this passage and say, but now I'm writing to you, not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother or sister who is sexually immoral or greedy or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or robber. Do not even eat with such a one. Well, that now, I'm writing to you, is a reference to what we call 1 Corinthians. But 1 Corinthians for us is at least Paul's second letter to the church at Corinth. At least Paul's second letter to the church at Corinth. Paul is going to talk about another letter that he writes, a tearful letter in 2 Corinthians chapter 2. And then we have 2 Corinthians, which is probably Paul's fourth letter to the church at Corinth. So our 1 Corinthians is probably Paul's second letter, and our 2 Corinthians is probably Paul's fourth letter. And if you're not really confused at this point, then you're not listening to what I'm saying, because this is really confusing stuff. In other words, there were multiple letters that Paul wrote to this community, and we don't have all of them. Okay? There's a lot that takes place between letter 1, though, and letter 2. And I want to talk briefly about that as well, because after Paul writes this first letter, Paul receives a letter from the Corinthians. And we see this it referred to in chapter 7:1. Paul says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote to me, it is well for a man not to touch a woman. So the Corinthians have written to Paul. And that little phrase, as I pointed out last week, perideu, occurs 4 times in the latter chapters of 1 Corinthians. And it seems to introduce 4 topics that must have been the subject of inquiry that the Corinthians have asked Paul about. So, now concerning, and he's going to talk about marriage and divorce. We'll deal with that a little bit later in the hour. Now concerning food sacrificed to idols. That's the subject of chapter 8. Now concerning spiritual gifts, Paul's going to deal with that in 12 to 14. And now concerning the collection for the saints, that's the subject of chapter 16. So here Paul is in fact responding. In 1 Corinthians, he is responding to the letter that the Corinthians have written. But 1 Corinthians is not just a response to the letter that the Corinthians have written, it's also a response to oral reports that Paul has received. And he makes mention of those on several occasions. For instance, he said, "It has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you, my brothers and sisters." He says in chapter 5, it's actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you. In chapter 11, it says, to begin with, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. So Paul's received oral reports, and we know based on what Paul writes, there is sexual immorality. In addition to the divisions that are present in the church, sexual immorality, there are lawsuits. We have members who are suing other members in pagan courts. We have problems of sexual immorality in terms of prostitution. We have other sexual immorality going on in Corinth. We have divisions. We have abuses of the Lord's Supper, and we have chaotic worship services. So all of those things are problems that are happening in Corinth that are not talked about by the letter that the Corinthians write. Paul knows about this from these oral reports. So, our 1 Corinthians, which is at least Paul's second letter to this church, is in response to the Corinthian letter, and it's going to deal with 4 topics: marriage and divorce, food sacrifice to idols, spiritual gifts, and the collection for the Jerusalem believers, and also these oral reports that are going to deal with factions, sexual immorality, lawsuits, abuses at the Lord's Supper, and chaotic worship services. And Paul's going to begin with the single most important problem in Corinth, and that is the problem of disunity. Disunity. And here's the passage I cited last week. Now I appeal to you, brothers and sisters. This is right at the beginning of the body of the letter. This is the very first substantive thing Paul is going to say in 1 Corinthians, so we know this is the important issue. Now I appeal to you, brothers and sisters, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that all of you be in agreement, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and the same purpose. For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you, my brothers and sisters. What I mean is that each of you says, I belong to Paul, or I belong to Apollos, or I belong to Cephas, or I belong to Christ. Has Christ been divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Were you baptized in the name of Paul? Disunity. Disunity. Factions within Corinth. And Paul's overarching theme, not only to the issue of disunity, but this theme is going to apply to all of the problems that we've seen are present in Corinth. The theme is unity within the community of faith. Everything needs to be done to preserve the unity. And Paul emphasizes that notion of unity when he talks in chapter 3 about these same individuals. What then is Apollos? Apollos is a disciple who is going to come in, or an apostle who's going to come in after Paul. So Paul founds it, and then Apollos is going to come in and build up the church. What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you came to believe, as the Lord assigned to each of you. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. The one who plants and the one who waters have a common purpose, and each will receive wages according to the labor of each. For we are God's servants working together. You are God's field, God's building. Again, that notion, it's the unity within the community, and there have been various people who have served, but what the purpose has been is to build up the community. to help the community to grow. Paul's idea of unity within the community is going to be applied to another situation, and this is something he has also heard about. That is the problem of incest. This is in chapter 5. Paul writes, "It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that is not even found among pagans, for a man is living with his father's wife. And you are arrogant? Should you not rather have mourned so that he who has done this would have been removed from among you?" Now, when it says a man is living with his father's wife, it's more than just living with his father's wife. Here is a man who is having sexual relations with his stepmother. And no one seems really that concerned about it. Paul is, but no one else in Corinth. It's sort of this idea, well, it doesn't really affect me, so I don't need to be involved with that situation. Paul says that's absolutely wrong. He goes on to say in chapter 5, "I'm writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of a brother or sister, who is sexually immoral or greedy or is an idolater, reviler, drunkard, or robber. Do not even eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging those outside? Is it not those who are inside that you are to judge? God will judge those outside. Drive out the wicked person from among you." This really sort of shocks my 21st century students because individual rights and the like, we're great individualists, and that's not Paul. It's the community that's most important, and sin in the community is a cancer on the body. And the only thing to do is to cut the cancer out. If the person is not going to change, drive out the wicked one from among you. And it's based, Paul is getting this really from Deuteronomy chapter 17. It says, "If there is found among you in one of your towns a man or woman who does what is evil in the sight of the Lord your God and transgresses his covenant, and if it is reported to you or you hear of it, and you make a thorough inquiry, and the charge is proved true that such an abhorrent thing has occurred in Israel, then you shall purge the evil from your midst." What people don't realize is that the actions of one person in a community affect the rest of the community. It's really easy to think, no, that doesn't really involve me, when in fact it does. That is like throwing a handful of dirt into a glass of water. In fact, everything is affected by that handful of dirt. And that's what Paul's saying in this situation. This man will not repent. If you have gone to that person and said that person needs to stop this, and they refuse, then you have to cut them off. The body is more important. The body is more important than individuals. And that's not a message that we take to very kindly in the 21st century. But it's a very, very important lesson. Paul and the ancients got it right. Our actions affect everyone in the community. It just doesn't affect us. It affects everyone. And that's what Paul's getting at. Well, on the other hand, even though they're not getting involved in this situation of incest, they don't like when other people attack them, that they are challenged by other people. So what they end up doing is having lawsuits. They say, well, you mistreat me, I'll see you in court. When any of you has a grievance against another, do you dare to take it to a court before the unrighteous instead of taking it before the saints? Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, are you incompetent to try trivial cases? Do you not know that we are to judge angels, to say nothing of ordinary matters? So believers can't decide among themselves who has been wronged and who is the wrong party. They're taking this to civil court. And Paul says, why are you doing that? Why are you taking your matters within the community to a pagan court? Isn't there anyone among you that is competent enough to decide? Isn't there anyone who can judge in the community? After all, he says, we are going to judge angels. It's a pretty remarkable thing. Do you not know that we are to judge angels? And then he goes on to say about lawsuits, he says, if you have ordinary cases, then do you appoint as judges those who have no standing in the church? I say this to your shame. Can it be that there is no one among you wise enough to decide between one believer and another, but a believer goes to court against a believer and before unbelievers at that? So basically, Paul's point is, based on unity of the community, drop those lawsuits. He says, in fact, to have lawsuits at all with one another is already defeat for you. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? You yourselves wrong and defraud, and you do it to believers at that. If you think you're going to win by going to court, the very fact that you have to go to court is a loss. That's a defeat. Settle it among yourselves or drop it. Unity within the community. Well, this also applies to another form of sexual immorality. We saw that in incest in chapter 5. Now in chapter 6, we're going to see another form of sexual immorality, and that is the issue of prostitution. I'll give you a little bit of background in this in just a moment, but let me read this passage to you starting in 6:12. One of the things I really like about the New Revised Standard Version, and I think it's probably true of other modern translations as well, is the use of quotation marks for some of these statements that you were going to see in Paul's letters. These statements, in fact, are Corinthian slogans. This is not what Paul is saying. This is how the Corinthians are interpreting Paul. So, for instance, Paul preaches a law-free gospel. You know, you're free from the law. If you've read Galatians or if you've read Romans, you sort of know that refrain, you're free from the law. Well, that's interpreted by the Corinthians as all things are lawful for me. That's not quite what Paul said, but that's what's heard. This is sort of what my students' interpretation of my words that are really interesting. That's one of the fun things about reading exams. You realize, what did I ever say that gave them that impression? But this is the student version of Paul's thinking here. All things are lawful for me, which means I'm free to do whatever I want to do. However, Paul responds, but not all things are beneficial. All things are lawful for me, say the Corinthians. Paul responds, but I will not be dominated by anything. Food is meant for the stomach and the stomach for food. We'll come back to that in a moment, but that again is another Corinthian slogan that they are touting that is justification for why they're doing what they're doing. Paul's response to that is, well, and God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for fornication, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the... Hang on, I moved something here that... No, that's me. I touched a...
It's on the keyboard. She disconnected and connected this last time.
Okay, let's see. Let me try again. Okay, sexual immorality, we're there. I'll get back to that. Sexual immorality. God will destroy... Oh. I can see it, but... You can't. Okay, let me try it at the end. We'll try. Okay, we're still searching here. Yeah, I did. Okay, now I probably just messed it up there. Okay, let me do. I was back on this slide. Okay, thanks for your patience. I'll try not to touch anything up here. Okay, food is meant for the stomach and the stomach for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. The body is meant not for fornication, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body, and God raised the Lord and will also raise us up by His power. Well, all of that sounds rather general. What is Paul getting at? Now we talk about fornication here. What's really the issue here? Well, you get it in the next few verses. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Should I therefore take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? Never. Do you not know that whoever is united to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For it is said, the two shall be one flesh. Okay, what you need to do is understand the Greek perspective over against the Hebrew perspective. So let me talk about the idea of the body in Greek thinking and the body in Hebrew thinking. Let's begin with the Greek view. And here you're going to be just dazzled by my drawings. But this Greek view is what's called a body-spirit or body-soul dualism. Body-soul dualism. These two, the soul and the body, are distinct from one another. They come from different locations. So the soul comes from heaven, whereas the body is earthly. Now, when those two get together, they're incompatible natures in Greek thinking. And in fact, the body prevents the soul from remembering where it came from. And so there is a statement, there's a slogan in Greek, soma sema. The body is a tomb. So the soul is entombed in the body in Greek thinking. Okay? Salvation, as a result, occurs when the body is shed and the soul continues living. That's known as immortality of the soul. Okay? So salvation is salvation from the body, not salvation of the body. Salvation from the body in Greek thinking. So a Greek person would say, a Greek thinker would say, I have a body. The essential I is the soul or the spirit in one, whereas the body is just sort of this outer being that's going to be shed at some point in the future. And therefore, you have in Corinth people that have this view, if the body is supposed to be shed, why not use it before you lose it? And that's what they were doing it. They were using it extensively at the houses of prostitution in the city of Corinth. Now, it's important to point out that in Corinth there were temples. There were cultic temples that employed prostitutes. And this is a part of fertility religions of the ancient world. These were very popular religions, and they employed prostitutes, and it was based on the idea of sympathetic magic. You may have seen, for instance, with a Native American rain dance. You see a Native American rain dance, that's a part of sympathetic magic. And what you do in a rain dance is that you pour water on the ground. Your actions are going to try and jumpstart nature. That's what you believe sympathetic magic. And that was what you did in fertility cults. If you wanted abundance in your life, you needed to exert your own virility and your own fertility. So you would pay a prostitute to have sex with her with the understanding that that was going to bring you great productivity in all areas of your life. Now, there were those kinds of temples that were in Corinth. Corinth is a port city. There's another city, in fact, next to Corinth. It is the port, but Corinth is a port city. And so there were cultic prostitutes there because sailors, after they've been out at sea for many months when they come into port are particularly religious and feel the need to go visit a temple. And so there were many, many of these temples in Corinth, and I guess the Corinthians had done this before they became Christians and saw no problem with continuing to do that afterwards. Why not use it before you lose it? That's what the stomach, the reference to the stomach before. Food is meant for the stomach and the stomach for food. The Corinthians were arguing, well, you've got these parts, you probably should use them because you're ultimately going to lose them, and that doesn't really affect my soul or spirit. That's just sort of this outer casing that's going to be discarded in the future. That is the Greek view. That is not Paul's view. Paul has a Hebrew view, and it's based on Genesis chapter 2, the creation of Adam. Here you have, in that day the Lord God made the earth and the heavens when no plant of the field was yet in the earth and no herb of the field had yet sprung up. Then the Lord God formed Adam, from the dust of the ground, Adamah, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. So the body is, in Hebrew thinking, is animated by the soul or the spirit. There is not life until the two are brought together. So if I could draw this diagram, it would be something like this. Here's the body, and then the soul or the spirit is breathed into it so that the soul and the spirit and the body are all one. They're all one. It's a unitary. It's not a dualistic where you have these two separate entities. It's all one that is needed for life. When those elements come together, the soul spirit is breathed into the body, then life begins. So in Hebrew thinking, it's not salvation from the body. The body is a creation of God. So the body is not something that is simply discarded. The body is what is going to be saved, because this is who you are. This is not irrelevant. In Hebrew thinking, this is. The body is who you are. Your body is how I know who you are. My body is how you know who I am. This is not irrelevant. This is, in fact, critical. And that's what God will redeem. So God, it's not immortality of the soul in Hebrew thinking. It's resurrection of the body. It's bringing back to life the body. Like the valley of the dry bones, if you're familiar with the image or the story in Ezekiel's writing, the prophet Ezekiel, it's the same kind.
Coming back.
Okay, it is. Okay. It's the same kind of thinking. This is going to be resurrected. What God has created, God will redeem. So in Hebrew thinking, it's resurrection of the body. So a Hebrew would say, not I have a body, I am somebody. The body is essential to who people are. And that's what is going to be redeemed. Okay? So that has ethical implications. The Corinthians think that what you do with your body is irrelevant, so why not enjoy it to the max before you lose it? That's not Paul's perspective. So he goes on to say, if he's going to refer to this passage. I haven't touched anything, I don't think, this time. Well, that's not looking so good. He's going to refer to the passage in Genesis chapter 2, which is the creation of Eve. And at the very end of that passage, after Eve is created, you have the passage that is read at every wedding ceremony. After the creation of Eve, he says, "Therefore a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh." Well, I tell my students that, in fact, as an ordained minister, I have officiated at the wedding of many, many people, a number of Gettysburg College couples. On August 1st, I officiated at the wedding of the 1,901st Gettysburg College couple. So, I officiate, but I make it clear to my students that when they, husband and wife, stand in front of me and make their vows and the like, that's not what marries people. I said, even in the eyes of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, just because you have stood before a clergy person does not marry you. There's a more quiet dimension. There is a more private dimension to the wedding ceremony that is the event that, in fact, truly weds one with another. How do you become one flesh? You become one flesh through sex, not through the ceremony. Therefore, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. Well, that is exactly the point that Paul is making here in Galatians. 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And I would show you this text if I could here. Okay, I'm going to do no signal, okay. No, it's not.
Oh, so I just lost that bit, huh? I'll try this again, see if that's.
There it is. Okay. Now, I've done that half a dozen times. And, and Sue shows up and does it once, and it works. No wonder they pay her the big bucks. Geez, oh man, I can't believe it. She walks in and unplugs and puts it. Oh, gosh. Okay. Well, that was humbling. Okay, well, this is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6, just after the passage that I'd read before. But anyone united to the Lord becomes one spirit with him. Shun fornication. Every sin that a person commits is outside the body, but the fornicator sins against the body itself. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, which you have from God, and that you are not your own, for you were bought with a price? Therefore glorify God in your body. Notice the number of times that Paul talks about body here. For the Corinthians, that doesn't register at all. The body to them is irrelevant. Paul says that's not true. Glorify God in what you do in your body. And when you unite your body with a prostitute, what you're doing is becoming one flesh. And I use the illustration with my students who I don't know really understand this, but I use the illustration of a joint bank account. So you can be a millionaire and you can marry someone who is in debt $2 million, and as soon as you're married, all of a sudden you've become a debtor. You've taken on the sin of that other person. And that's what Paul says here. When you are united with another, you take on the sin of that other person. So if a prostitute is your first sexual experience, you've automatically become an adulterer, because you've been united with someone who is an adulteress. One flesh. That's pretty remarkable. And my students are really quiet at this point. Because I tell them, watch out who you hook up with. Shun fornication. Therefore, glorify God in your body. Now, that's one group in Corinth. One group in Corinth is just having way too much sex with all kinds of other people than their spouse. But there are others who have this Greek view that think that because any urge of the body must be evil. It's earthly, it's not spiritual, so any urge that you have must be an evil urge. And Paul is going to be every bit as critical of that other group as he is of the first group. But he talks about the second group starting in chapter 7. And this is where he talks about the letter that they wrote. Now concerning the matter about which you wrote, it is well for a man not to touch a woman. Now that's not Paul's statement. That's the Corinthian slogan that Paul is repeating to them. It is well for a man not to touch a woman, but, here's Paul's response, because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. So I say to my students, what does Paul say is the basis for marriage? Does it say love in this passage? No. Sex. Now I've got him in the palm of my hand. Here, what's the reason? What's the reason for marriage? It's for sex. Because of cases of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. And what I really point out here too, notice the egalitarianism in this statement. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. Now my students don't know what conjugal rights are, so I have to tell them that means sex. The husband should give to his wife her right for sex, likewise the wife to her husband. But notice the egalitarianism here. It doesn't say women were created for the satisfaction of men. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband doesn't have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Okay? The simple fact of the matter was, Paul's addressing a very specific situation in Corinth. There were people who were married, or there were people who were getting married. To show how spiritual they were not having sex. They were living together, but they were having no sexual relations. And Paul says that's not what marriage is. Marriage is not simply having a roommate. If you don't want sex, don't get married. But if you want sex, then get married and then have it. Now my students are really excited about this. I say it's your religious responsibility. If you're going to get married, it's your religious responsibility to have sex. They really love that. However, you can abstain. You can abstain, but notice what Paul says here. Do not deprive one another sexually, except perhaps by agreement for a set time. Now, in the old RSV translation, I don't like this translation because they really messed up my joke here, but it said in the old translation, except do not deprive one another except perhaps by agreement for a season. And I used to be able to say that didn't mean baseball or football season. But it's got to be a mutual agreement for a set time to devote yourselves to prayer. For a very specific reason, you can abstain from sex when it's mutually agreed for a set purpose, for a set time, then come together again sexually so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this by way of concession. That is, the concession is the abstaining. You can abstain for a short period of time, but it's got to be mutual, and it's going to be for a specific purpose. I say this by way of concession, not of command. I wish that all were as I myself am. Paul's going to explain that he's single at the time, but each has a particular gift from God, one having one kind and another a different kind. Now, Paul is going to say, to the unmarried and the widows, I say this, that it is well for them to remain unmarried as I am, but if they are not practicing self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion. And this is often, I think, that's a terrible statement. I think it's misunderstood. It doesn't mean that marriage is the best way to kill passion. Paul is simply saying that if you are not married and you need sex, get married. That's fine. That's exactly the way it should be. He said it is well for them to remain unmarried, as I am. Paul at this time is married. There are theories that Paul was married at one time, but he's a widower probably, or widower at this time. We don't know. But if Paul is supposed to be, seems to be sort of an official, according to Acts, maybe an official somewhere in Judaism, and if he were an official, it would be assumed that he would have been married. But he's not married at the time of writing 1 Corinthians. So here it is, advice to the unmarried and widows. Now, there were people who were getting married, Christians who were getting married and not having sex, and Paul's critical of that. Okay? He's also going to talk about another group in Corinth that were married and were getting divorced to avoid having sex with their partners. These were married couples, and both husband and wife were now Christians, and because they had this Greek view that anything of the body, bodily urges, were evil, they were getting divorced for the purpose of avoiding sexual contact. And Paul is very critical of them as well. He says, "To the married I give this command, not I but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does separate, let her remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife." That's not saying, and I want to make this clear, that's not saying that divorce is always wrong. Paul's addressing a specific situation here where people are getting divorced for religious reasons. And Paul's saying that's wrong. That's wrong. He's not saying, if you're being beaten by a spouse, maybe it's time to get out of town. That's not his perspective in this particular passage. And it's been misinterpreted as that. However, what do you have if one spouse is a believer and the other is not a believer? That's what I call a mixed marriage here. He goes on to say, "To the rest I say, I and not the Lord, that if any believer has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. And if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him, for the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife. And the unbelieving wife is made holy through her husband." How can that be? One flesh. One flesh. So in the previous chapter, one spouse takes on the sin of the other. In this case, one spouse takes on the faith of the other. Two are one. And if there is faith in that unit, there is a faithful unit. For the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, the unbelieving wife is made holy through a husband, otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. He goes on to say, "But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such a case, the brother or sister is not bound to it. It is to peace that God has called you. Wife, for all you know, you might save your husband. Husband, for all you know, you might save your wife." How? Through sex. My students at this point are just aghast. They have no idea what to think. But this is remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. Again, this one flesh notion. One flesh notion. Paul's going to finish this chapter on another note, and I want to give you some background. It came back. Gosh, I can't believe it. Okay, I'm going to step away here. Okay, we're going to talk about Jewish apocalyptic eschatology. And if you have been in this class for the last 20 years, you've probably heard me talk about Jewish apocalyptic eschatology. This is a kind of thinking that was very prevalent in the first century world, and it was particularly a part of Pharisaic Judaism, which is Paul's background. Paul was a Pharisaic Jew, and this is a part of Pharisaic thinking. But it is dualistic, it's temporally or historically dualistic. It believes in two ages. this evil age, and it's going to be, in contrast to that, the age to come. This age is characterized in Jewish apocalyptic eschatology as one that is ruled by Satan and the forces of evil. And it is characterized by evil and injustice, suffering, and death. But in this kind of thinking, it is believed that God will bring a decisive end to this evil age on the day of the Lord, which is going to be a day of judgment. God is going to judge all of those who have lived in this evil age. How is He going to do that? Well, God is going to have to bring everyone back to life, the resurrection of the dead. So we have this notion of the resurrection of the dead tied to this Jewish apocalyptic eschatology. Those who are found worthy when they are raised from the dead will be allowed to live into the age to come. And the age to come will be characterized by God's rule and characterized as well by the absence of evil and injustice, the absence of suffering, and the absence of death. Okay? This is a belief in what's known as the general resurrection that's a part of this apocalyptic eschatology, and we see that talked about in Daniel chapter 12. At that time, Michael, the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. There shall come a time of anguish such as never has occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. So at that time, that is at the end of the age, many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. That's a reference to the resurrection, the general resurrection at the end of the age. And those who are raised then will be judged. Those who are found worthy will be allowed to continue. They will awake to everlasting life, and the others will awake to everlasting shame and contempt. So that's resurrection of the dead. Well, related to this Jewish apocalyptic eschatology and the coming of the end of the age comes the idea of the Messiah. Because the Messiah was believed to be one who was going to come at the end of the age and usher in the age to come. And that is based on a passage in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And in this chapter, the author is going to use the small Hebrew word Beth, which means house, in 3 different ways. This is a story of King David. David has conquered all of his enemies, and he is sitting in his own house, his palace, and he decides that he would like to build a house, a temple for God. So as Nathan, his prophet, go to God and get his okay on his building plans, and Nathan says, I'm sure that'll be fine, but I'll check in upstairs anyhow. So he goes and he asks the Lord, and the Lord says, thanks, but no thanks, David. It's thoughtful of you to want to do this, but I'm not going to let you do it. Your descendant will do it. But because you've been so thoughtful in wanting to build me a house, I'm going to build you a house. And there, God means dynasty. So house means palace, it means temple, it means dynasty. So, now when King David was settled in his house in 2 Samuel 7, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, the king said to the prophet Nathan, see, now I'm living in a house of cedar, but the ark of God stays in a tent. Nathan said to the king, go do all that you have in mind, for the Lord is with you. And now Nathan is going to come back and tell him what the Lord has said. Moreover, the Lord declares to you, David, that the Lord will make you a house, a dynasty. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house, that is a temple, for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And then he goes on to say, your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. That promise is made in approximately 1000 BCE. Fast forward to 587 BCE. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon is going to destroy Jerusalem. He's going to destroy the walls of Jerusalem. He's going to destroy the temple that was built by King Solomon, the son of David. He is going to deport Judahites, the people who live in Judah at the time, the creme de la creme of society, are going to be sent into captivity in Babylon. But before he does that, he is going to capture the last Davidic king, a man by the name of Zedekiah. And then he's going to kill all of Zedekiah's offspring in front of Zedekiah, put his eyes out, and then ship him to Babylon, where he dies in captivity. So in other words, all of Zedekiah's family is executed before Zedekiah and his other Judahites are sent into captivity. Well, in light of this, the Babylonian captivity or the exile, Jews in the exile say, go back to this promise that was made to David. How can God be trusted if in fact he said there will always be a descendant of David on the throne? When now we have no throne, we have no land, we have no temple, we have no king. How is this going to be fulfilled? Well, it came to be believed that instead of this referring to a succession of kings, this would refer to one king. And the king was anointed on the day he ascended to the throne. And so a king was often called Mashiach, which is the Hebrew for anointed one, from which we get the word Messiah. The Greek equivalent is Kreo or Christos, Christ. Messiah and Christ are the same terms, just one from Hebrew, one from Greek. Okay? So, how is this believed? I mean, how's this going to happen? Well, when the Messiah comes, it will be the end of the age, and the Messiah will live forever, because he's going to live and bring in the new age and live into the new age where there will be no death. Many in the first century claimed to be the Messiah, and I've told you this before, but one of the ways that they determined whether people were the Messiah is they had them killed. Ah, shucks, we had high hopes on this guy, but he died. Can't be the Messiah, right? Well, that's a problem. That's a problem because Christians claim Jesus died. And here is a very famous 20th century Jewish philosopher, theologian, Martin Buber. You may have heard of Martin Buber before. But this is referring to a passage in Mark chapter 8, the confession of Peter, where Peter says, "You are the Christ. Who do people say that I am?" and the like. "Who do you say, Peter, I am?" Peter steps forward, "You are the Christ." Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi, according to Martin Buber, that Jesus was the Christ was a sincere confession, but not a true one. And it has not become any less untrue for having been repeated down the centuries. Why? The Messiah cannot have come at a particular moment of history because his appearing can only mean the end of history. The world was not redeemed 19 centuries ago because we still live in an unredeemed world. So Buber is picking up on the fact that Jesus died and the world was not redeemed. And that's not what the Messiah is supposed to do. His coming is supposed to bring in the new age where there is no death. That helps us to understand Paul's perspective. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, "For Jews demand signs and Greeks desire wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews." Why is Christ crucified a stumbling block to Jews? wasn't supposed to die, and the new age is not here. There's still death, there's still evil and injustice in the world and still suffering. The new age is not here. So how is it possible that we can claim that Jesus is the Messiah? Well, here is the Christian sort of reinterpretation of Jewish apocalyptic eschatology. It still recognizes this evil age, but it recognizes that in the death and resurrection, the new age has begun. But it will not be here in its fullness until the day of the Lord, which in the New Testament is called the parousia, the coming of Christ. And on that day, then the new age will in fact take place, the dead will be raised, and then the new age will begin, where there will be none of those things. Evil, injustice, suffering, and death. Scholars have likened this, one in particular has likened the death and resurrection